Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first press conference of today, Day 2, World Economic Forum on Africa 2017, our 27th meeting in Africa. One of the longer running periods of intellectual research we've been performing at the World Economic Forum is Global Competitiveness. It's one of our core research projects. We launch it every year. We like to think it provides a guide to policymakers and leaders everywhere on the future prosperity and productivity of over 140 nations in the world. So here we are today in Durban, South Africa, launching the Africa Competitiveness Report. It's a collaboration between ourselves, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. Very delighted to be joined by representatives of each of these institutions who are going to tell us a little bit more about what are the key competitiveness priorities for Africa in 2017. There will be time for Q&A. I'll just introduce my panel. To my immediate left is Philipp Rösler, my colleague at the World Economic Forum, member of the Managing Board. Klaus Tilmes is Director Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Hadj is Principal Research Economist at the African Development Bank. I'm going to start by asking you, Philipp, just to give us your insight from the forum's perspective on competitiveness priorities here in Africa.
Yes, thank you, Ollie. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. So first of all, I would like to thank our partners, the World Bank as well as the African Development Bank, for an excellent cooperation. And it's so timely to have now this report, 2017. As you may know, we need in the next 20 years around 450 million new jobs on the African continent. And if everything stays like it is, so nothing additional will happen, no action, so we will achieve maybe 100 million, which is way beyond the need for the people. So here are some really good suggestions, ideas, how to improve the competitiveness for the entire continent. You can see it's separated in long-term and short-term ideas. Start with infrastructure, education, good governance, cutting red tape. So I think you should use this truly as a guideline, because the report is one thing, and we are again very grateful, but the second thing is the implementation. So really use this for implementation. And on that note, I would like to hand over to my colleagues, because they are the authors and they have the deep knowledge in terms of what to implement. But again, implementation is key.
Thank you, Philipp. And Klaus, the key really here is job creation. It's on everybody's mind. It's urgent. We talk about it a lot. We're sensitive to suggestions that we're a talking shop here at the forum, and we're keen to see action. What can we do differently in 2017 to create those jobs that Africa desperately needs?
Thank you very much, Ollie, and let me sort of echo Philipp's comments in terms of how, first of all, how much we appreciate this excellent collaboration with both the WEF as well as the African Development Bank. I think this is a good example of actually joining forces across international organizations to make this really a top-line agenda. Just to re-emphasize what it actually means to see the working age population in Africa grow by leaps and bounds over the next 2 decades. Essentially, when we break down this number of 450 million, that means 75% of them will find employment in agri-industries and in micro-enterprises, about 20% in services, and only about 5% really in the manufacturing sector. So trying to actually understand what this means in terms of developing stable wage employment, our research really shows that on the one hand, government policymakers have absolutely understood the urgency of putting jobs at the top of their agenda. No matter which country we visit, I think this is sort of the central point of discussion. But I have to also recognize that some of the traditional recipes and prescriptions as stable economic, macroeconomic policy, supportive investment climate, improving the quality of human and physical capital only goes so far. So one of the, I think, specific points that we wanted to drive home is to really look at a more differentiated response. The first one, and I think I'm very happy to see that the forum discussion already highlighted this, is to understand the transformation potential of agro-industry and agro-processing. If you look at the changing food pattern and nutritional requirements in Africa, we see this as a huge opportunity for productivity increases. The good thing is that a lot of this can actually be done and the value can be captured within Africa itself. So we have put a really strong focus in many of our programs around agro-industry and agro-processing. The second one is, of course, Africa is also, unfortunately, home to many of the fragile countries. And I think 19 out of the 35 classified countries as fragile are in Africa. So for us, that means really assistance programs that target vulnerable groups, specifically in vulnerable regions, in order to avoid further destabilization. The third one is open trade policies, and in particularly those that emphasize the integration potential within Africa. We see, and again, I think that there's a recognition that that is an untapped potential in East Africa, for instance. We're also working closely with OHADA in West Africa. So we see real potential in terms of showing political commitment around regional integration and the value chains that could be facilitated through this. Another point is the development of labor-intensive manufacturing. And yes, there has been a lot of skepticism in terms of the job loss potential around automation. But at the same time, I think that there's a lot of good work that is actually starting. If I think of Ethiopia, for instance, there's a real way of harnessing now the power of manufacturing in garments and leathers, in light manufacturing. And I think a determined approach really gets countries up on that learning curve early on before it is really too late. So again, sort of those are some of our specific recommendations that really take a much closer look at the differentiated pattern that we see in both Sub-Saharan Africa as well as Middle East and North Africa. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And there's lots of points there which I'm sure we'll come back to when we get to questions. Before we do, Bart El Hadj, you're at the AfD. Your research contribution to this report was principally, I believe, around development of competitiveness in cities and industrial zones. Tell us a bit about your findings.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like just first to acknowledge the collaboration, and it's not only the report that we make, but afterward we disseminate the report, we talk to stakeholders, so that's what we did for the 2015 edition. We'll do the same. We're trying to push for more implementation, to have action, as Philipp was talking about. So in terms of the cities, if you look at the trends, we are talking about here, a very high growth of population, and you have also very rapid urbanization rate. So what will be the implication of these? First, people that will be moving to cities, and cities will be larger, so you need to create urban infrastructure, because the urban infrastructure today is strained. So more urban infrastructure, including affordable housing. But the other thing is creating jobs, and we know that most jobs will be created in cities, and even today most jobs are in cities, so these need to be increased. So basically we are arguing that we need to make cities more competitive, and we look at what policies we need to implement to make cities more competitive. Of course, we know the usual recommendation: improve the business environment, increase urban infrastructure and infrastructure in general, and so on. But we wanted to focus on some specific policies. The first one is about urban planning, because when you look at the constraint to competitiveness in cities is the lack of urban planning. If you don't plan ahead, then you don't have the land and resources to build the urban infrastructure, to have land for housing and so on. So this needs to be taken seriously, and also take into account the socio-economic development of the past few years in the urban plans. And the second one is focusing on affordable housing. With other research, we found that Africa has a huge housing backlog. So if we don't focus on this, we will not be able to create jobs, because people, if they live in slums, they will not be able to go to where the jobs are. So affordable housing is important not only for improving the living standard of urban household, but also for job creation, because housing actually has a lot of extensive linkages, and it has a multiplier effect, and it's very labor intensive. So for us, this is a way to create jobs. So focusing on this has two effects: jobs and also improving the living standards. And the other policy we want to put on the table is about a special economic zone. We know that cities need to improve the business environment. These recommendations have been made over and over again. We're still not there, so it's a long-term policy that need to be implemented. But before we get there, we can create zones where you have the infrastructure, you have a regulatory environment that is appropriate for businesses to be created, to create jobs, and to prosper. So this special economic zone, although not a panacea, but they can be a start for job creation, because we know that, as Philipp said, we need to change the landscape, what's going on. We need to create a lot more jobs and more quality jobs in the future. So this need to be done. Thank you.
Just to go back on the point you made about the fact that we know a lot of these prescriptions and we know a lot of this advice. How do we persuade governments, for example, let's take housing, if there's such an obvious linkage between building affordable housing and inspiring economic growth and development, how do you persuade leaders to actually build this housing if it's not been done before, if earlier advice on this issue hasn't been taken?
So actually, what we're seeing is that you don't need to persuade them to address this. They are aware of the issues. In many of the countries, over 20 countries, we found that you have housing programs. The problem is about implementation. And the bottlenecks in this implementation is that there is no cooperation between stakeholders. Without that, you cannot address it, because you need to build at massive scale. So there is the willingness there, but it's not well implemented. So that's where we can come as a financial institution like the African Development Bank, the World Bank, to help, because, you know, like we just created a unit in the bank for cities and urban infrastructure that will focus on this. And I know that, for example, the IFC is very much focused on housing development in Africa. So helping countries better implement programs that will have better leverage.
So we're starting to see critical mass in terms of financing being made available to kickstart this house building program across the region.
Yes, it's more coming, and you have even private equity that is putting money on housing. So it's increasing in the region.
Let's see if there are any questions. I'll take the first question from the floor if we have any. Okay. Well, look. Let's pause and let anyone think. Klaus, I'd like to come back to you because, sure, again, we're very sensitive to this need for the great ideas that get generated to turn into action. What are the next steps? Well, you've given some very good, clear points here on trade policy, on processing and pursuing further development of agro-industries, etc. So what are the next steps in terms of taking these ideas and building the kind of support we need to make it happen?
So maybe let me sort of step back a little bit in terms of looking at the macro dialogue. I was just talking to Philipp about it, that Germany has taken through the G20 a very important leadership position to put a very strong focus on Africa. And I think that is something that we welcome very much. It's something that also is actually not so much a government-driven or sort of development finance-driven initiative, but one that really tries to harness the role of private investment capital, and think whether this is domestic or foreign. And when you start looking at this, one of the biggest tasks for policymaker is to actually embrace this whole concept of risk, whether this is risk at a country level or risk at a project level. And what I've seen over the last year or so is to really recognize the awareness of what it takes to make these investment opportunities, many of which are long-term, like housing, for instance, to make those worthwhile for investors. And I think that's where we are coming in to look at financing modalities for projects that de-risk some of these project financing structures. And the other one is at the country level to really create a perception and the reality that this is a welcoming and attractive opportunity for investors to take a look at. And I think ultimately, while we talk about jobs, let's make no mistake, 90% of these jobs will have to be created by the private sector. So in other words, if you do not open yourself to that potential, it will not really help address the shortcomings. So to give you one or two examples, I was very interested to see or to learn that Tunisia is actually the world's fourth largest exporter of olive oil against very tough competition from Greece, Spain, and Italy. In order to actually create more value and capture more value for Tunisian olive farmers, what is required is to actually reposition the whole olive industry in Tunisia from sort of low-end bulk production to niche production and really create sort of a brand for Tunisia. That's an area where I would say the private sector can actually come in with positioning, with marketing, with packaging, with logistics. And I think the type of jobs that are created there, those are the ones that we need for the future. Another example is farm to market. There's been a lot of discussion in terms of what this actually means. So for us, this means really looking at changing some of the bargaining positions, particularly of smallholder farmers, so that they are not just participants in regional value production around food, but that their bargaining power actually translates into capturing some of the economic benefits that we assume will come from this. I was really intrigued by sort of capturing these 4 Ps, that the food in Africa is going to be increasingly purchased, processed, perishable, and what was the last? Anyway, those were the ones. And when you start looking at this, that means the entire food chain really needs to have very much an upgrading in terms of what is provided to urban consumers that you mentioned, what is required in terms of food chain and retail possibilities. So that's where we really see a lot of possibilities for bringing in private investment, particularly also African investors, to take an advantage of these economic opportunities.
Okay, so one last question from me before we close this session. Klaus, you've given me some good examples there, and we are an optimistic, if realistic, organisation. We like to believe that we can solve or help contribute to solving the world's challenges. Mr. Hadj, give us some examples you've seen over the past year of best practices in sub-Saharan Africa, where you've seen you can perhaps inspire our audience watching us online as well as here in the room that competitiveness levels are being raised and productivity potential is being fulfilled.
So one example on the housing front, I think we can look at Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is a country where it's relying on itself. It has a housing program where it says, you know, this housing is not only for building housing, but it's part of our economic development program. So they have training for SMEs and micro businesses that can be working in this, and they link them with bigger developers. So it's private and public partnerships, and they built more housing than the rest of sub-Saharan Africa combined if you take out South Africa in the past 10 years. So they built more housing. This is going on in Ethiopia, and the good thing is that other countries have noticed it, and they are trying to replicate. You have countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya, and the like. They are going to Ethiopia, they are going to Morocco to learn more what is being done so they can improve this. So that's just one thing that I think has worked very well. But I wanted to talk about another issue that we mentioned in the report, because many of the policies we talked about are on the demand side for job creation, labor demand. You need to create businesses. You need to help them grow so they can demand labor. But you need the other side, which is the supply side. And there you need to have the right skills. So we emphasize that we need to train people. We need to improve technical and vocational training so people acquire the skills that are currently needed in the labor market, and also reform education programs that will train them for future need of skills. So that's an important aspect that we emphasize in this report.
And in fact, the World Economic Forum published a report yesterday, The Future of Jobs and Skills in Africa, where we produced a snapshot of the current situation with regards to skill shortages, because it's an important point. Whilst we have hundreds of millions of people looking for work, we have millions of jobs where the right skills are not available. And one of the key findings, which I was quite staggered by, was that across the region, around 40% of the people of the workforce will need entirely different skills in 5 years' time. So none of us know what skills we're going to be needing to do our jobs by the year 2020. Thanks very much, gentlemen. I really appreciate you coming in and launching this report with us here at the World Economic Forum. The session is now over. Thank you for joining us online as well.